So we looked at in the earlier video how we can assign permissions on the Entra ID application. Now in this video, we'll talk about the how we can provide permissions at a subscription, resource group, and resource level. So when we are interacting with Azure, working on Azure, so we have subscriptions. So under the subscriptions, we have resource groups. Under the resource groups, we have resources. So when we create a virtual machine, that virtual machine will be part of a subscription and a resource group. Like that, when we create a storage account or an app service, any kind of a resource we create, that should be a part of a subscription and resource groups. Resource group. Now we get a lot of requirements. As we see, we create multiple subscriptions in Azure, like dev, QA, production. There could be a different set of people managing different set of resources. Could be one requirement could be there are different set of people who manage the dev subscription. There are different set of people who manage the QA, and there are different set of people who manage the production subscription. Now here, how do we basically provide permissions to the only access to the respective people? Now within the production, we might have different projects which are existing or different applications which are in the production subscription, which are segregated based on the resource groups. Like we have an apps, VMs, DBs, and there are different set of people who manage the DBs resource group. There are different set of people who might be managing the applications. There are different set of people who are managing the virtual machines. Now we need to ensure that only the people who manage those resources get access to those resources. But when we provide permissions on the resource group, there could be a lot of resources under that. But within this particular resource group, we see a specific resource like a Synapse, a firewall, a VNet, VM, app service, like whatever it is. Now, how are we going to? Now there is a requirement that, okay, a set of people are responsible only for managing the Synapse services. So sometimes we get mixed requirements, and so which we call as the least privilege access model will be followed, that if a user needs to manage Synapse, he should have access only to the Synapse. So what happens here is when we assign permissions on the subscription level, the permissions will automatically get inherit to the resource groups and resources level. So if I'm assigning a permissions on a subscription level, it means that user will automatically get permissions on the resource groups under that particular subscription and all the resources under that particular resource groups. So sometimes this may not be suitable or meet the requirement of the least privilege model. So I don't want to provide access to all the resource groups for this particular user. So if I give permissions on the subscription, it is getting permissions on the resource group level and resource level. Then we have, when we provide a permissions at a resource group level, then by default that user gets permission on all the resources available under that resource group. Let's say if I'm giving permissions on this particular resource group, okay, if I'm providing a permissions on this particular resource group, then automatically the user will get access to all the resources under this particular resource group. Now, if we want to restrict permissions to a specific resource, then we can provide access only to that particular resource. So when we provide access to that particular resource, the user will get access only to this particular resource. So we need to be very clear that where we need to provide access, whether do we need to provide access on a subscription level or a resource group level or a resource level. If you are providing a permissions on a resource level, it is not required to provide permissions on the resource group level or subscriptions. So in Azure, each and every resource is an independent resource. So if I give a permissions on the Synapse resource, the user will get access only to this particular resource. He will not be able to see or access other resources which are available within that particular resource group or a subscription. Similarly, if I provide a permissions onto this particular resource group, the user will get only access to this resource group and the resources which are available under this one. So that particular user will not be able to view the other resource groups which exist, and he cannot access these resources. Similarly, if I'm providing a permissions on the subscription level, the user will get access to all the resource groups and all these things. However, he will not be able to view the other subscriptions which are existing in the Azure tenant. So we have to be very clear where we have to provide permissions. Now, above on these things, we have called as a management groups. So by default, when we set up an Azure account, there will be one management group called as we called as a tenant root management group. So by default, all the subscriptions which are created in the Azure tenant will be part of the root tenant management group. So if you assign permissions on the root tenant management group, then the permissions will be applicable on all the subscriptions. So I don't need to provide permissions on the individual subscription, individual resource group, and individual resources if we assign permissions on the tenant management group. But we have some kind of requirements. Let's say when you have some 200 plus subscriptions exist in your Azure tenant, now spread across like in India, Europe, US, and different geographical regions. Now for purpose, we want these subscriptions to be visible only to a certain people, and other set of subscription to be a specific set of people. Now what we can do is we can create a management groups. We can create a management groups, sub-management groups under the root. So we can call it as a US team. I can call like an India team, whatever resource groups, the management group's name, and we can organize the subscriptions under this one. Now we can put these two subscriptions under this management group, and we can keep another two subscriptions or whatever that required under this one. Then when we assign permissions on this particular management group, then automatically that permissions will be applicable on the subscriptions which are part of this management group, the resource groups, and the resources. Similarly, when we assign the permissions on the India management group, and if the production subscription and any other subscriptions are part of this particular management group, then automatically the users who are part of this particular one will get permissions on all the subscriptions and resource groups and resources. So we can provide permissions to the individual user, or we can create a groups in Entra, or if the on-prem user accounts got synchronized to the Entra, we can use those groups to assign permissions. So it's not only that we have to manually add the user these things, but we can do this. So based on requirement, so create the necessary management groups. And so by default in Azure we have called as a privileged roles. As we discussed in the earlier video, that in order to provide permissions, we need to have a roles. So roles are nothing but a set of permissions mapped to that particular role. So by default, there are three privileged roles in the Azure which can be managed at management group level, subscription and resource group, and individual resource level. A owner has full permissions on the respective objects. So if I assign a permissions as a owner on the US management team management group, then he gets full permissions on this management group so that he can assign someone else. He can manage the permissions on this resource group and sub-level also, like subscriptions, resource groups, resources. He can manage the permissions on the subscriptions. He can create resources like the resource groups, app services, virtual machines, databases, whatever he want, he can create it. If I'm providing a permissions as a owner on a specific subscription, that user can modify the permissions on the subscription group. So he can add the users or remove the users, give permissions, and he can create the n number of resource groups and n number of resources based on that. So where are we assigning that permission? Similarly, if you give permissions on the resource group as a owner, so he can modify the permissions on the resource group, and at the same time, he can create the resources under this particular resource group. So we should be very clear that where we need to provide owner permissions for the users. So perform all the actions and resources. So he can create, modify, delete the resources, creation, okay. Contributor role. The contributor role will not have permissions to assign users or modify the permissions on the resources. So if I give contributor a role on a US team, so he can create resources like resource groups under both the subscriptions and create virtual machines and whatever these things which is under this particular one. But he cannot add one more subscription, but he cannot modify the permissions. Similarly, a reader can view the resources. So when we say can view the resources means when I give a reader permissions on the management group, that particular user can view all the permissions, and all the resources on both the subscriptions. So based on need to need basis, we need to provide permissions. We need to identify where to provide permissions. On which object do I need to provide permissions on the management group, or do I need to provide permissions on the subscription level or a resource group level or resource level? Let's see that. So when I go to the portal, look for type for management groups. Management groups. So when I go for a management groups, I see a tenant root group. So under this one, so we have 3 subscriptions which are existing. So I create a management group. I'm giving it called as an India team. And I'm just giving it India finance team is going to manage this. Create. So let me create one more management group. I called as an US-team. US finance team will manage this. created. Let me go back and come back here. Still this. Yeah. Now we can see the two management groups got available here, India-team and US-team. So as of now, these subscriptions are under the tenant root group. Let's say I'm moving it to India management group. And we would see subscriptions under this one, still one. Okay. Now we would see two subscriptions under root. Let me move them to the US. Let me move this to US. So I have this subscriptions under this management. So what we did here now, we created two management groups, India and US, and I organized these things. Now let me go to the Entra. So I have the users. So let me select any one of the user. So I'm taking acute user 5. So let me go to the India finance team and we will see access control, which is IAM. So click on access control. We would find this feature on subscription, resource group, resource level. Everywhere we will find this option called as access control. Go to the access control, role assignment. So as of now, who has permissions on this particular one? We would see one user is the owner on this particular resource group, sorry, on this management group. View my access. I can check what kind of access I have here. And let me go to role assignment, add role assignment. Privileged administrator roles. Click on this one, owner. So I'm selecting the owner. Click on next. Do you want to provide permissions to the user group service principal or managed identity? So I'm selecting an user 5. Conditions. So here we can see when user can do or what user can do. Allow users to only assign selected roles to selected principals. So you're saying that only this role is being assigned to this user. Allow user to assign all roles except privileged roles. You're telling that you want to assign other roles also accept the privilege, or allow user to assign all roles. So whatever we selected, like in all the privileges, we want to assign it, review and assign, and review and assign. Now Kit user 5 has the permissions on the India team. Now let me reset the password and log in. Let me go to in another browser. So I logged in with user 5. I go to the subscriptions. So I see only one subscription. Whereas in my case, we have 3 subscriptions. In India, we have only one because we gave permissions for Akit and user 5 on the India management group. But if you really see here, we have 3 subscriptions. But within that management group, we have only one subscription, so that user is able to see only that subscription. Same way, when you are assigning permissions on the other management group, then he will get that. Similarly, when the user is being assigned with a subscription, then you get. So let's go to the subscription. So if I assign permissions on Azure training, access control, role assignments, add a role assignment, a privileged role. I'm giving a contributor role, user, include user 5. So this user now has permissions on 2 different subscription with the 2 different permissions. So on the Azure training subscription, we gave him as a contributor. On the management group, we gave him India management group, we gave him as a owner. Now let's go here. Let me refresh my screen. Let me sign out and sign in again. Whenever we assign the permissions, it's better that we sign out and sign in again. Yeah, we can see now we are able to access the both. So now I go to Azure training, access control, add a roles. You see it's got disabled. because I'm only having a contributor permissions on this subscription. But whereas Apple access control, and we can see I'm getting permissions because I have the owner permissions coming from the management group. So that way you can assign permissions on the subscriptions, resource groups, and resource level. So make sure that before designing the permissions, how you want to manage that permissions, you design it.